Employer branding is only important for writing job adverts. That is absolutely not true, and I'm going to talk you through why that is. Hello and welcome to Engage and Thrive, also known as EAT, your coffee catch-up with me, your host, Taelon, where we will go through common problems and hurdles that come up in business, marketing and advertising and try and demystify them. I know firsthand how complicated and confusing it can seem with all the different acronyms and all the things to do in business. So let me try and help you be better in business. First things first, let's start with grabbing a coffee. For this one, as employer branding is something that I feel isn't mainstream known, we're actually going to start off with the vocab today, so I can explain first what employer branding is and terms around it, and then we'll go into the myth bust. So the first one is obviously employer branding. This is your reputation or your branding around your people side. So everything your company is known for or the brand it has about a place to work. EVP, employer value proposition. So this is your people version of your USP. You know how in consumer or B2B marketing you would have what's your unique selling points. This is your unique selling points for people. So why people would want to work at your company. Internal branding. So this may be different to your external branding, your employer branding. You may change the tone slightly or tweak it, but this very much is about your values, your behaviors, your culture, and the communication you have internally as a business, the internal voice. Culture. So this is around what it's like to work for your business. And a lot of people may look for culture presentations or information about the culture when actually assessing whether or not to work at that company, because you want to understand how your values align, how you're treated, how management leads the business, just is it the right vibe? And the final one is onboarding. So what does the first 90 days look like for a person joining your company, joining your business? What's their 90-day experience, the first 3 months, which typically is when someone then has a end of probation meeting. I said final one, however, I'm going to throw in a couple more. So B2E, this isn't necessarily a term that's used, but actually if you think about it, you've got B2B, which is business to business, B2C is business to consumer, so B2E should be business to employee. The other one I've used in a different episode was talking about an ideal employee profile. And again, we could go into this a lot more in depth. As I mentioned, now that we have the vocab covered off, it's easier to discuss the myth busting. So your employer brand is obviously everything around your people side of your branding for your business. And the reason why this is not only important for job adverts is because there's so much more around it and that involves it. And I think a lot of times employer branding is left to HR departments or talent acquisition departments. And if you're not a big company, you may not even have HR departments or even HR person. It may be a CEO or a COO, especially if you're a small business, doing your hiring, your firing, your culture, your people side of things. And actually an employer branding or your whole people communication side a lot of times gets forgotten. But when you think about it, people are what make a business and people are delivering your product or your service. So if you don't have your people side nailed, you're potentially having a high turnover of people, because if you're not understanding who you are as a business, how do you maintain and how do you grow and develop people? Which nicely leads me into number one, what is employer branding? So if we think about some of the episodes we've covered off around consumer branding or corporate branding, your employer branding is everything like that, but for your people side. And the reason why I'm so passionate about it is because the people are what make a business. Okay, at the end of the day, if you don't have people, how are you delivering your product or service? And so it's really important to think about your people experience. And it's really important to have your people strategy and your people branding just as important as having your corporate branding, because you need to have those people to build your business. So when you're thinking about things involved as part of your employer branding, this is not about ping pong tables and slides in the office. This is everything in terms of your tone that you're using with your people, your values, your employer value proposition, so your reason why people would want to work for you. And then of course there are other parts around what are your perks, what does your company stand for. So things like people may offer offline days, or people may offer offline retreats, or how do you treat remote and hybrid working? Again, how does that align with the values of a business for people? What are working hours? What are different time zone of working hours? Do they have to be in the office? How do you deal with feedback? How do you deal with management? How do you deal with promotions? How do you deal with people understanding the different progress they have in a role and their ability to apply for other roles? And that's all, I suppose, like in the internal things when you think about the actual knit and grit of the roles, but actually then think of the end-to-end employee experience of the website that they view for different jobs that you have listed. So you may have a separate careers website. Then you think about the application experience of someone applying for a job, and then the interviews, and then the offer, and then their first 90 days, their onboarding experience. And then if they actually wanted to resign, what does that look like? What's their offboarding experience? How do you get leavers feedback? Which leads into number 2, employer branding is everyone's job. So if you're thinking about building your culture as your business, and you're wanting everyone to essentially be your brand ambassador and your advocate of your product or service when they work for you as a brand, using that same thought trail, they're also the advocate about their working experience. And people are the first to complain when they're unhappy in their job, or if they're super happy in their job, which is exactly your voice of your employer branding, because people will talk about why they love their job, what they love about their job, the culture of a company. I think that's something, again, that's like undervalued, of how much people value the company culture when they're applying for a job, or reading people's experiences of company culture, which is when you get the likes of Glassdoor or LinkedIn, and people are reading reviews and wanting to get feedback. And a lot of times people will want to get feedback from other people before going into a job. So if you're thinking about people talking about your brand or your employer brand, if you're not doing something about your employer brand is getting built without you shaping it. The same as your brand, if you're not controlling that conversation or molding that conversation, it's getting done without you, whether you like it or not. But people are potentially customers of your product or service before they want to work for your company. And the same being said, if someone works for your business and then leaves your business, would they still continue to be a customer of your business? And again, thinking about the impact of their word of mouth. So if they've had a bad experience being an employee, and that was of a product or service, they potentially are never going to refer your product or service because of their bad experience working for you. And then think of that impact. If people are then talking about buying your product or service, well, my friend worked there and it was a terrible place to work, so why would you buy into that bad culture? Again, from a values perspective, people may align with that and think, I don't want to buy into that, or I don't want to support that CEO because of the way that CEO treats their employees. Number 3, how to strengthen your employer brand. There is so much more that we could go into, minor details about employer branding, and I'll pick topics around this that I'll evolve further in other podcast episodes. But things to think about with your employer brand, like I said, your employer brand is everything to do with your people communications. And something to also consider is it's not only about how you attract people to your business to work, a great place to work, or how does it look like, how does it feel like from a culture perspective, but also how you could turn people off. And again, this sounds strange whenever I say about turning people off, but the same being said, if you're upfront and transparent about your values, your culture, how you are as a place to work, allowing people the ability to understand whether they're going to actually fit in up front before going through a whole application process and an interview process is a lot easier and is a lot better for both sides of the party. The other thing to think about, and this leans into an experience that I had working for an agency in London years ago, was also the rejection process. So as a company, if you are rejecting people, so rejecting their job application or they're not a right fit, how does that look and feel like? What's that experience of saying no to someone? Because what you need to consider is every person you're interacting with is also a potential customer for your product or service. So if they've had a bad experience with you, how does that feel for them? And how would they talk about that to their family and friends? Again, all that word of mouth. And the other thing to think about is don't be cliche when you're trying to share what your company and business stands for and feels like from a people's perspective. If you're going to be doing stuff on social media, especially on LinkedIn, gone are the days of everyone wanting to see slides and ping pong tables in offices, the likes of Google back in the day. But actually people want to see the behind the scenes. People want to see the working hours. People want to see the true colors of your business. So remember that, and don't be stereotypical with the content, and especially if you're going to be advertising for a job, don't be generic about this is just our job description, this is what we're looking to hire for. Think about transferable skills, think about the language you're using, thinking about that exact person that you want for that role, which I will leave you with something to think about around ideal employee profile. So I mentioned this in an episode before, and it's something that I've really been thinking a lot about. So I will do a whole dedicated episode about how you can consider your ideal employee profile. But as a wrap up, employer branding is not only relevant when you're doing job adverts, and it should involve everyone in the business actually constantly evolving and molding what your employer branding looks like, just as much as your corporate branding. It's just as important, because remember, people make the brand, people make the business. They're the ones delivering your product and service all the time. Thank you for joining for another episode of Engage and Thrive with your host Taelon, and see you next week.